Tonight, we're going to explore what it would actually take to send a civilization into deep space and keep it alive long enough to reach another star. Not just the rockets, not just the fuel, the people. A generation ship is not a spacecraft the way we usually imagine one. It is a sealed world, moving through absolute darkness, carrying everyone who will ever be born on it toward a destination none of them will live to see. The crossing could take centuries. Some proposals say 1,000 years or more. Others push further still. That is 40 human generations, born inside, living inside, dying inside. Each one of those generations will contain people who were children once, who played in the corridors and learned the names of the stars from screens, and grew up, and fell in love, and had their own children, and grew old, and died. Each generation will contain people who are curious, and people who are frightened, and people who found the ship ordinary, and people who found it claustrophobic, and people who devoted their lives to understanding it fully, and people who spent their lives trying not to think about it too hard. 40 generations of all of that. 40 generations of the full range of what it means to be human, compressed into a sealed vessel moving through darkness toward a destination that gets no closer in any human lifetime. 40 generations who will live and die entirely within those walls, who will know no other world, who will tend the ship because the ship is theirs, and because there is nothing else to tend. And the question that keeps serious researchers awake at night is not whether the engine will hold, it is whether the civilization inside the ship will. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. She is 7 years old, and she has never seen a horizon. She knows what the word means. She has seen photographs, the ones stored in the archive that the teachers used during geography lessons. In those photographs, there is a line where the land meets the sky, and everything in the image stretches outward in a way that feels impossible to her, like the world forgot to stop. She stares at those photographs the way you might stare at a diagram of something that cannot exist. She understands it, but she does not feel it. Her world has walls, not in a way that feels wrong to her. This is simply what the world is. The corridors that connect the living quarters to the greenhouses. The low hum she has always heard, the one that lives somewhere beneath the floors. The one the adults call the engine. The particular quality of the light in the morning cycle, slightly warmer than the afternoon cycle, designed by engineers who understood that the human body needs something to mark the passage of time. She knows the smell of the recycled air, the particular clean flatness of it. The way it smells different in the agricultural sections, where the growing plants give it back some of the quality that filters cannot fully replicate. She knows the exact sound the water filtration unit makes when it shifts phase, a low cycling hiss she has heard so many times she only notices it when it stops. She knows every face in her section, every name, every family, the way someone in a small village knows everyone who has ever lived there. She does not think of any of this as confinement. It is simply home. What she does not know, because no one has found a gentle way to explain it to a 7-year-old, is that she will live her entire life here. She will grow up in these corridors. She will fall in love here, have children here, grow old here. She will tend the same systems her parents tend, and teach her children to tend them after her. And when she dies, she will die still inside these walls, still decades away from the star the ship is pointed toward. She will never arrive. She is not meant to. She is not the mission's destination. she is the mission's middle. This is the thing about generation ships that tends to get lost in the excitement of the concept. We imagine a launch, we imagine an arrival, we see the ship as a vehicle that carries people from one world to another, and we think about the physics, the distance, the engineering required to make that crossing possible. These are not small problems. A spacecraft capable of carrying a living population across interstellar space would be among the most complex objects ever built by human beings. The fuel alone, the propulsion system alone, represents engineering challenges that humanity has not yet solved. But the engineering, enormous as it is in a certain sense the more tractable problem. The harder problem is this: a generation ship is not just transporting people from one place to another, it is containing a civilization. For centuries, in a sealed environment, with no resupply, no outside contact, and no possibility of rescue. Every single person who will ever live aboard that ship will be born into a world they did not choose, raised to maintain systems they did not build, in service of a mission whose beginning they cannot remember and whose end they will not live to see. That is not a transportation challenge, that is a question about the nature of human society itself. The nearest star system to our own, Alpha Centauri, sits roughly 4.2 light-years away. A light-year is the distance light travels in a full year, moving at about 300,000 kilometers per second. Even at that speed, the crossing takes more than 4 years. For a physical object carrying people, the constraints are far more severe. At the speed of the fastest crewed spacecraft ever launched, the trip would take tens of thousands of years. Even at speeds that serious generation ship proposals consider theoretically possible, somewhere between a fraction of 1% and a few percent of the speed of light. The voyage to the nearest candidate for a habitable world takes centuries. Some proposals accept timelines of 1,000 years or more. 1,000 years is approximately 40 human generations. Think about what 40 generations means in the other direction. 40 generations back from today puts you somewhere in the early medieval period, a world where most of Europe could not read, where the largest cities held a few 100,000 people at most, where the technology of everyday life had changed almost imperceptibly from the centuries before it. The people alive then did not speak any language currently in use on Earth. Their political structures, their understanding of the physical world, their daily rituals, their entire frame of reality was so different from ours that they would be nearly unrecognizable to us as members of the same civilization. Now seal those people into a ship together. Point it at a star. The people who launch know why they are going. They remember Earth. They chose the mission, trained for years, said their goodbyes, and understood with full adult comprehension what they were entering. They carry within them the felt weight of everything they are leaving behind. Their grandchildren will have been told about it. Their great-grandchildren will have inherited a story. By generation 10, it will be closer to mythology than memory. This is the question the engineering proposals do not answer. You can model the fuel consumption. You can calculate the shielding requirements. You can estimate the caloric needs and the power draw and the water recycling rates with impressive precision. What you cannot model with any confidence is what happens to a human civilization when you remove it from the planet it evolved on, seal it inside a machine, and ask it to remain coherent and purposeful for 1,000 years. No human society has ever done that. Not even close. And that is where the real answer to the question of how long a generation ship could last begins. Not in the engine room, in the people. Before the ship carries anyone into deep space, someone has to sit down and decide exactly what goes on it. not just food and fuel and spare parts. People, specific people, chosen for specific reasons, carrying specific knowledge and specific skills. And once those decisions are made, the doors close, and everything inside that ship is everything the mission will ever have. Imagine the planning document. A mission architect works through the numbers: population size, caloric requirements per person per day multiplied by centuries, water recycling efficiency targets, power generation capacity over the long term, crop rotation cycles inside the agricultural modules, seed variety preservation for the foods the population will depend on, medical supplies and the depth of training required to use them correctly when the original doctors are gone and the next generation of doctors has learned from people who themselves learned from people who learned from the founders. Each of these problems is connected to the others. Population size affects caloric requirements, affects agricultural module size, affects power demands, affects structural weight, affects propulsion requirements. The calculations are enormous, and the variables are interdependent in ways that make small errors compound across time. A 1% miscalculation in food production efficiency sustained across 100 years does not produce a 1% problem. It produces a crisis. But each of these problems, enormous as they are, has a known structure. You can calculate your way through them. You can build in redundancy. You can test the systems before launch, run them under stress, identify the failure modes, engineer around them. The machinery of the ship is bounded. It obeys physics that can be measured and modelled and verified. Then the mission architect reaches the page on governance at year 300, and the structure of the problem changes entirely. No equation governs what a community believes about itself after 6 generations. No simulation reliably predicts whether the people born into a sealed world will maintain the social contract designed by their ancestors. The engineering problems are hard because the numbers are large and the margins are thin. The human problems are hard for a different reason. They involve people who have not yet been born, making decisions that were never theirs to make, about a mission they inherited from people they cannot imagine. Every serious generation ship proposal in the scientific and philosophical literature acknowledges this gap. NASA researchers, independent physicists, sociologists, psychologists, and ethicists who have studied the concept seriously all arrive at the same observation eventually. The machinery can be designed. It can be tested before launch. It can be improved incrementally as understanding grows. The social architecture of the mission, the governance structure, the cultural transmission system, the psychological support framework, these are also designed before launch. The documents are written, the systems are put in place, but unlike the machinery, they cannot be meaningfully tested in advance. You cannot run a 40-generation social simulation. You cannot know, before the doors close, whether the community you have assembled and the institutions you have built will still be recognizable in 3 centuries. Consider the specific nature of that uncertainty. An engineer testing a propulsion system knows what a failure looks like. The numbers do not add up. The thrust falls below specification. The material fractures under load. The failure mode is visible, measurable, and in principle correctable before launch. The engineer can iterate until the system works. A social scientist studying the governance structure of a generation ship has no equivalent test. They can draw on historical analogues, comparative political theory, case studies of isolated communities, and computer models of social dynamics under confinement. They can design the structure carefully and defend each design choice with evidence. But they cannot launch a simulation for 40 generations and see what actually happens. The test can only be run once, in real time, with real people who cannot be replaced if the system fails. What history does tell us, and it tells us this with a consistency that should give any mission architect pause, is that no human civilization has ever maintained its founding principles, its original governing structure, and its original social contract intact across 40 generations without external reinforcement, contact with other civilizations, or access to new resources. Not one. Every civilization that has persisted for that long has been transformed beyond recognition by war, migration, internal collapse, reformation, and the constant pressure of contact with the outside world. The Roman Republic lasted roughly 5 centuries before it became the Roman Empire, and the empire was unrecognizable from the republic that birthed it. The longest continuously documented cultural traditions belong to indigenous communities who maintained them through deliberate practice across thousands of years. But even they transformed over time, and they always did so in living contact with the land, with neighbouring groups, with the full friction of an external world. The generation ship removes all of that friction. It removes the land, it removes the neighbours, it removes the outside world entirely. What remains is a community sealed inside a machine, with one purpose: keep moving forward. Whether that community can remain a coherent civilization across the centuries required to fulfill that purpose is not a question engineering can answer. It is the central question of the entire enterprise, and the honest answer, drawn from everything we know about how human societies actually behave under pressure across time, is possibly, but only under conditions that no human community has ever voluntarily sustained for long. The gap between the designed plan and the human reality is where the real mission begins. There is something that happens to knowledge when it is passed from one generation to the next without the experience that originally gave it meaning. Think about a skill you learned from someone who had practiced it for decades, a craft, a trade, a technical ability. When they taught you, they passed along not just the steps, but the judgment they had built through years of doing, the small corrections, the sense of when something is almost right but not quite, the intuition for when a rule applies cleanly and when the situation requires something the rule did not anticipate. That judgment cannot be fully written down. It lives in the body of the person who has spent years doing the work. It gets passed along in the teaching, but always imperfectly, because the person learning has not yet had the years of doing that produce the feel of the thing. Now imagine that you teach the same skill to your child. Your child absorbs the steps and some of the judgment, but not all of it. Your child teaches it to their child. Each transmission carries the steps forward, but the lived judgment behind the steps erodes a little more with each passing. The form remains. The felt understanding of why the form is what it is gradually becomes thinner. Multiply that erosion across 10 generations. 30, 40, this is the forgetting problem aboard a generation ship, and it is one of the most serious structural threats the mission faces. Not because anyone intends to forget, not because the people are careless, but because forgetting is what human knowledge does when it is separated from the experience that gave it meaning, and no system of documentation has ever fully prevented it. A child growing up aboard the ship attends classes. She learns about Earth from screens and archives. She sees photographs of mountains, oceans, forests, deserts. She is told what rain feels like. She is told what a horizon looks like. She is told why the ship exists, where it is going, and why that matters. She understands all of it intellectually, the way someone on Earth might understand a detailed description of an alien landscape. The information is accurate, it is informative, but it is entirely disconnected from any lived sensory reality. She has never been cold from weather. She has never heard wind. She has never stood on ground that was not a manufactured floor. When she grows up and teaches her own children, she will pass along what she knows. But what she knows about Earth is already one layer removed from any bodily truth. Her children will be 2 layers removed, their children will be 3. By generation 5 or 6, Earth is not a memory. It is not even a story told by someone who heard it from someone who was there. It is a founding myth. A creation narrative. True in the way that foundational stories carry genuine meaning and shape real identity, but no longer tethered to any experience that any living person has had. This matters enormously for the technical knowledge the ship depends on. Anthropologists who study isolated communities have documented what happens to practical knowledge when it is separated from the environment that made it necessary. Pacific Island navigators developed extraordinarily precise methods of celestial and wave navigation, knowledge sophisticated enough to guide voyages across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. When colonial contact disrupted the conditions under which this navigation was practiced, the knowledge eroded faster than anyone had anticipated. Within a few generations, techniques that had been transmitted continuously for centuries became fragmentary, then ceremonial, then lost. The people who came after could recite the forms, they could no longer perform the function. Aboard the Generation ship, this pattern carries life or death weight. The water recycling system works in a specific way because the engineers who designed it understood the chemistry involved. They wrote it down. The manual exists in the archive. But a manual is not the same as understanding. And understanding is what allows someone to adapt when the situation changes in ways the manual did not anticipate. When the system begins to behave in a way the manual does not fully describe, the engineer who can respond to it needs more than the steps. She needs the reasoning. She needs to understand not just what to do, but why the procedure works, so that she can recognize when the procedure needs to change. If that reasoning has eroded across generations, the manual becomes a script. A script performed without the understanding behind it is only reliable in exactly the conditions it was written for. The moment those conditions change, the script fails, and there is nothing beneath it to fall back on. The ship's founders knew this. Every serious Generation ship proposal includes plans for knowledge preservation. Mandatory technical education structured around deep understanding rather than procedural memorization. Cultural archives with multiple redundancies. Designated knowledge keeper roles. Some proposals draw on historical models of oral culture knowledge transmission. The techniques developed by societies that maintained complex technical and navigational knowledge across thousands of years without written records, through ritual repetition, song, and social structures that made knowledge transmission a community-wide responsibility rather than an individual one. These are real solutions to a real problem. They are not invented, and they have genuine historical support. But they share a fundamental limitation. They require the people of Generation 15 or Generation 25 to continue maintaining systems of knowledge preservation that were designed by people who have been dead for a century. For reasons that no longer feel viscerally urgent to anyone currently alive. The emergency that made knowledge preservation feel critical was the launch. The launch happened generations ago. The emergency is now an abstraction, a story in a history file, one of many stories in many history files, and the felt urgency that made the original engineers treat knowledge preservation as a survival priority has faded with the people who felt it. The ship can carry every book ever written, every manual, every schematic, every training video, every recorded lecture, every preserved specimen. What it cannot carry, sealed in an archive or stored on a server, is the urgency that made those things worth learning. That urgency has to be regenerated by every generation from within, and in a sealed world where the systems mostly work and the corridors feel ordinary and the engine hum has been the background sound of every living memory, the pressure to maintain that urgency is hard to sustain across centuries. Consider what the specific failure looks like at the level of individual disciplines. A generation ship requires not just general technical competence, but deep specialist knowledge across dozens of fields simultaneously. Atmospheric chemistry, structural biology, electrical engineering, mechanical systems maintenance, agricultural science, medical practice, genetic management, water treatment chemistry, computer systems, navigation. In an open civilization on Earth, these disciplines are maintained by large communities of practitioners who are constantly producing new knowledge, challenging old assumptions, training the next generation in the full depth of current understanding, and adapting their methods in response to new discoveries and new problems. The community of specialists is large enough that even significant losses can be absorbed without the field collapsing. Aboard the ship, each discipline may be represented by a handful of people at most. When a specialist dies unexpectedly, before a full knowledge transfer is complete, the loss is not replaced from a pool of available alternates. It is absorbed by whoever is available, trained as quickly as circumstances permit, and the gap in understanding is papered over with whatever partial records exist. Over 40 generations, disciplines that began with 10 deeply trained specialists may be practiced by people whose training was built on incomplete foundations, whose trainers' had already absorbed several generations of knowledge loss. The result is not ignorance. The people practicing the discipline know a great deal. They can perform the standard procedures, they can handle the expected problems. What they may no longer have is the depth of understanding that allows them to recognize when a problem is genuinely new and respond to it as something new, rather than forcing it into the framework of the familiar procedures. This is the specific vulnerability that the archive cannot protect against. You can store the knowledge. You cannot store the judgment that comes from a discipline practiced at its full depth across many generations of practitioners who are pushing the boundaries of what was known. The ship arrives at the destination with the knowledge it managed to preserve. Whether that is enough depends on what the destination actually requires. That urgency has to be regenerated by every generation from within. And in a sealed world where the systems mostly work, the corridors are familiar, and the engine hum has never changed, generating that urgency is the hardest invisible task the ship faces. There is a number that generation ship designers work with and worry about more than almost any other. It does not describe the engine, it does not describe the hull, it does not describe the propulsion system, or the power generation capacity, or the life support efficiency. It describes the people. The concept is called minimum viable population, and it refers to the smallest group of human beings that can sustain healthy genetic diversity across multiple generations in a closed biological system. Below this threshold, something begins to happen inside the biology of the community, slowly, silently, over decades, and then over centuries. A process that cannot be seen or felt by any individual, but accumulates nonetheless, like rust forming on the inside of a sealed pipe that no one has opened in a generation. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what genetic diversity actually does for a population, and why it erodes when a population is closed. Every human being carries 2 copies of most genes, one inherited from each parent. Many of these gene variants are harmless or beneficial, carrying no particular consequence either way. But some variants carry risks, predispositions to certain diseases, vulnerabilities to specific pathogens, reduced immune function in particular areas, in a large, open population constantly receiving new members and new genetic material. These potentially harmful variants tend to remain rare. The diversity of the gene pool is wide enough that most harmful combinations simply never come together. The chances of inheriting 2 copies of the same harmful variant from 2 unrelated parents are low. In a small, closed population, the protective breadth erodes over time. When the same group of people has children together, generation after generation, without any new genetic material entering from outside, the diversity of the gene pool contracts. Variants that were rare become more common as the same combinations cycle through smaller and smaller sets of ancestors. Harmful variants that would never have met in an open population begin to encounter each other more frequently. And over enough generations, the health consequences of that narrowing become visible in the population itself. Reduced immune response, higher incidence of certain heritable conditions, lower overall reproductive success in some lineages. This is not theoretical risk. It is documented reality in any population that has gone through what geneticists call a bottleneck, a sharp reduction in size that limits the genetic diversity of every subsequent generation. Cheetahs are famously vulnerable to disease because a prehistoric bottleneck left them with almost no genetic variation. Some island populations of animals show similar fragility. And isolated human communities, from island populations to carefully studied historical genetic records, show measurable signs of the same process when they have been closed for long enough. For a generation ship, the founding population is the bottleneck. Whatever genetic diversity is present on launch day is all the mission will ever have from the living population. No new genetic material arrives from outside. The gene pool can only contract. The question of how large the founding population needs to be to avoid this becoming fatal across a multi-century voyage has occupied geneticists who study the problem seriously. Early estimates, which focused on short-term survival over a few generations, suggested that a few hundred people might be sufficient to maintain basic health. But those models were designed for timescales of decades at most. When researchers extended their modelling to the timescales actually required for interstellar travel, the numbers changed substantially. Cameron Smith, a researcher at Portland State University who studied generation ship genetics specifically, produced estimates suggesting that a minimum of around 10,000 people may be necessary for a multi-century crossing, accounting for genetic drift, the random loss of gene variants over time even in the absence of selection pressure, and the need to maintain enough diversity that the arriving population is biologically healthy enough to found a viable colony. Other researchers have produced somewhat different numbers depending on the model assumptions, but very few serious estimates put the required population below the low thousands for a mission of this duration. Most proposed generation ship designs imagine populations in the hundreds, sometimes the low thousands. The gap between those numbers and what the genetic models suggest is one of the quieter and more uncomfortable facts in the entire field. There are proposed solutions. Frozen genetic material, stored gametes, embryos, or DNA sequences that can be used to introduce new diversity into the living population across generations through assisted reproductive technology. In principle, this approach extends the effective genetic population of the ship far beyond the number of people physically aboard. A ship carrying 2,000 people, but also carrying a genetic library representing 20,000 additional individuals, has, in a meaningful biological sense, a much larger founding pool than its corridors contain. The limitations of this approach are real. The technology required to maintain frozen genetic material and use it effectively must remain functional across centuries, through whatever equipment degradations, power fluctuations, and knowledge erosions the mission encounters. The social consensus required to actually use the technology, each generation voluntarily participating in a genetic management program designed by people who died before their grandparents were born, must be maintained across the same centuries through the same governance structures that are already under pressure from the other problems aboard, which brings the biology, as so many of these problems eventually do, back to the society inside the ship. The genetics can be managed. Managing it requires knowledge, sustained cooperation, and shared intention maintained across every generation of the crossing. Aboard a ship where the original urgency behind every procedure is slowly fading into the background, that kind of sustained voluntary cooperation across centuries is not a quality you can design into the hull. On the day the ship launches, there is a governance document. It was written carefully, over years, by people who thought seriously about the long term, people who read history, who consulted political philosophers, who studied the collapse of isolated communities and the survival of others, who tried to build into the document every lesson they could extract from the human record. It describes how decisions are made, who holds authority and for how long, how disputes are resolved before they become crises, how mission parameters can be amended and under what conditions, how resources are allocated across a community where some work is harder and less desirable than others, but all of it is necessary. It is, in the broadest sense, a constitution for a civilization, the best one these particular people could write. And like every constitution ever written, it was written by specific people, in a specific historical moment, shaped by the specific concerns and tensions of that moment. It could not anticipate everything, no document ever has. The founders were wise and careful, but they were also human, and they knew the world they had lived in, not the world that would exist aboard the ship in 200 years. Now imagine that document at year 200. The people who wrote it have been dead for 6 generations. The specific tensions they were designing around have long been resolved or replaced by entirely different ones. The original factions that competed during the planning phase are gone. The compromises built into the document to satisfy those factions may now serve nobody, or may now serve factions whose existence the founders could not have predicted. A council is meeting. One faction argues that the founders' intent must be honoured precisely. The document says what it says, and any deviation from it risks losing the thread that connects the current community to the original mission. Change the document once, under sufficient pressure, and it becomes changeable forever. The mission was not designed to be renegotiated by each generation according to its own priorities. Another faction argues that honouring a document written for conditions that no longer exist is not fidelity, it is rigidity. The founders designed the governance system to serve the mission. If the literal interpretation of the document now impedes the mission in ways the founders could not have anticipated, then slavish adherence to the letter of their work betrays the spirit of it. A third faction is asking a different question entirely. They were born here, their parents were born here, their grandparents were born here. They have no living memory of Earth, no felt connection to the people who launched this ship, no grief for a world they never saw and cannot miss. They inherited this mission the way a person inherits property from a relative they never knew, property that comes with obligations and restrictions, and a management plan written by someone who has been dead for a century. They are asking, quietly but persistently, whether the choices of the founding generation bind them forever, simply by virtue of the fact that they were born inside those choices. This debate is not academic. The outcome determines how the ship's resources are allocated for the next decade. It determines who sits on the committees that make the daily decisions about food distribution, maintenance priority, and reproductive policy. It determines whether the people in this room and the people they represent will continue to feel that the system governing their lives is legitimate. Legitimacy is not a soft concept aboard a generation ship. It is structural. A community that has lost confidence in the fairness of its governing system does not simply become unhappy. It begins to withdraw. People comply with rules they believe are arbitrary or unjust in form, but not in spirit. The small acts of cooperation that keep a closed ecological system running, the extra effort, the voluntary care, the willingness to accept short-term personal cost for collective benefit, depend on the felt belief that the system is working for everyone. When that belief erodes, the system becomes brittle. This is not a hypothetical argument in some imagined future. Versions of this exact conversation have appeared in virtually every isolated human community that has persisted for more than 2 or 3 generations. What makes the generation ship version uniquely difficult is the absence of any release valve. Every governance system in human history has relied, at least implicitly, on the possibility of exit. Democracies allow electoral change, constitutional revision, and ultimately emigration to somewhere else. Authoritarian systems survive partly because dissent can be expelled, imprisoned, or absorbed into territories beyond the centre of power, removed from the system without destroying it. Even the most controlling historical communities, from closed religious orders to long-duration seafaring expeditions, had some mechanism through which irreconcilable disagreement could be resolved by separation. Someone could leave, someone could be sent away. The faction that lost could find somewhere else to be. Aboard the ship, there is no somewhere else. Expulsion is a death sentence, and even the most authoritarian governance structure cannot routinely execute its dissidents without destroying the social trust the systems depend on. There is no outside territory. There is no exile. Every person aboard, regardless of their relationship to the founding mission, must continue living in the same corridors, breathing the same recycled air, depending on the same water and food and power, maintained by the same community. Researchers who have studied long-duration, isolated environments, Antarctic overwintering stations, extended submarine deployments, simulated space missions lasting many months, consistently find that governance disputes and perceived unfairness are among the primary drivers of dangerous internal conflict. In those environments, the missions last months. External authority can intervene if necessary. The people involved can be rotated out. Across a 1,000-year voyage, no external authority exists. No one can be rotated out. Whatever the community cannot resolve within itself does not get resolved. It accumulates, and in a closed system with no outlet, accumulated unresolved conflict eventually finds its own expression. The ship does not need an enemy outside to encounter serious danger. Given enough time and pressure, it can generate its own. There is a particular kind of psychological stress that appears in research on isolated environments, and it does not come from dramatic incidents or acute crises. It comes from sameness. Antarctic researchers who spend the polar winter at remote stations, submarine crews on extended deployments, and participants in long-duration space mission simulations all describe recognizable versions of the same experience. In the early phase, novelty and shared purpose carry the group forward. The environment is new and interesting. There is enough to notice and enough to do that the mind stays engaged. The strangeness of the situation itself provides a kind of stimulation. As weeks become months, the edges of the environment become familiar, then completely familiar, then fully mapped. The same corridors, the same faces, the same sounds, the same smells, the same light at the same times, the same meals, the same tasks, the same conversations cycling through the same limited range of topics with the same limited set of people. Psychologists who study this phenomenon describe it as monotony-driven cognitive narrowing. The mind, deprived of genuine novelty, gradually loses some of its natural sharpness. Small irritations that would be easily forgotten in an open environment, where you could simply walk away and encounter something different, have nowhere to go in a closed one. They linger, they attach themselves to other irritations. They accumulate into grievances that are disproportionate to their origins. Interpersonal friction that was manageable in the early phase becomes amplified by the impossibility of escape. Researchers who studied the Mars 500 simulation, a 520-day analog mission in which 6 volunteers lived in a sealed habitat designed to replicate a round trip to Mars, found measurable deterioration in the group's functioning by the later phases. Reduced physical activity, disrupted sleep, withdrawal from social engagement, tension that had no outlet. This was a carefully selected group of highly trained adults living in a facility on Earth with full knowledge that they could end the simulation at any time. The stress appeared anyway, reliably, in the form that long-duration confinement research consistently predicts. Researchers call the late mission psychological dip the third quarter phenomenon. It appears across environments and mission types. The opening phase is manageable because it is new. The closing phase is manageable because the end is visible. The long middle, where there is nothing to mark the passage of time except the passage of time itself, is where the human mind struggles most consistently. Now think about what this means aboard a generation ship, where the middle is not a phase. For most of the people who will ever live on that ship, the middle is their entire existence. They were not born at the beginning. They will not live to see the end. They inhabit the long, unmarked stretch between departure and arrival, where there is no excitement of the launch and no hope of arrival to hold on to. Just the daily work of maintaining a world that is always the same world. A child born into that condition does not experience it as a phase of a longer thing. She experiences it as reality. And there is a question that evolutionary biologists take seriously about what happens to human beings raised in environments that their nervous systems were never calibrated for. Human beings are the product of millions of years of evolution in open environments. On grasslands, in forests, along coastlines and river valleys, environments with weather and seasons and the constant low-level sensory variation of a living world. The human nervous system did not evolve to process a corridor that is always the same temperature, always the same humidity, always the same light. It evolved to process a world that changed, constantly and unpredictably, in ways that required ongoing attention and adaptation. The ship provides none of that variation. Engineers who design generation ships take this seriously. Proposals include simulated weather cycles inside the habitat areas, full-spectrum lighting that changes with artificial seasons, architectural variation designed to prevent the felt sense of total environmental repetition, large interior spaces, natural materials, living plants, water features, art, music, cultural programming, everything a careful design team can think of to give the inhabitants a felt sense that their world has more dimension than a corridor. These are thoughtful and evidence-based solutions. They help. Research on isolated environments consistently shows that people do better in environments designed with these elements than in environments that lack them. But the honest conclusion from the same research is that these measures reduce the psychological costs of confinement. They do not eliminate them. The human nervous system evolved for open environments across timescales that no design intervention can fully counterbalance. Good interior design can make the ship more livable. It cannot make the ship into a planet. And you can build a ship with simulated weather. You cannot build a ship with a real sky. There is a subtler dimension to this problem that the environmental design proposals do not fully address. Researchers who study long-duration confinement have found that one of the most consistent predictors of psychological difficulty is not the presence of discomfort, but the absence of genuine agency over one's environment. People can tolerate extraordinary hardship when they feel that their choices matter, that their actions have consequences, that the world around them responds to what they do. What erodes well-being more reliably than physical difficulty is the experience of living in a world that does not respond to individual agency in any meaningful way. Aboard a generation ship, the environment is precisely controlled. That is a feature, not a bug. The temperature is stable because the temperature must be stable. The food supply is managed because the food supply must be managed. The lighting cycle follows a schedule because the human body needs a schedule. Every aspect of the physical environment is governed by systems that were designed to be stable and that depend for their continued function on people not altering them unilaterally. This means that the most fundamental human need, the need to act on the world and have the world respond, must be satisfied entirely through social and cultural channels, through work, through relationships, through art, through governance, through the feeling that one's participation in the community matters. For many people, across many generations, that will be enough. Human beings are adaptable. The capacity to find meaning in work, in community, in creativity, in the small daily rituals of a well-organized life is genuine, and it is not trivial. But it is also not universal, and it is not unconditional. It depends on the social environment providing enough variation, enough genuine challenge, enough felt consequence for individual action that the human nervous system does not experience its situation as stagnation. A ship that is running well provides few genuine emergencies, few moments where an individual's decision makes the difference between catastrophe and survival. Most days are maintenance days, routine days, days where the protocols were followed and the systems functioned and nothing out of the ordinary happened to anyone. Over generations, in a population that has never experienced anything else, what that sameness does to human motivation and human aspiration is a question that no research on months-long confinement can fully answer, because the timescale is wrong by orders of magnitude. The ship's designers can build for variation. They can create challenges, competitions, artistic traditions, social structures that provide genuine stakes and genuine consequences within the community. They can make the social world rich enough that most people find it sufficient. What they cannot guarantee is that every person in every generation will find it sufficient. And in a closed system where the people who do not have nowhere to go and nothing outside to redirect their energy toward, the question of what they do with that energy is one that the design cannot answer in advance. Year 300. The ship is moving, the engine is running, the systems are functioning. From the outside, if there were anything outside to observe it, the ship looks exactly like what it was designed to be, a piece of technology operating as designed. Inside, something is happening that the design documents did not fully model. The movement has been growing quietly for about 2 decades. It has no official name, but the people in it refer to themselves informally as the present people. They are not extremists. They are not trying to stop the ship or disable the systems. Most of them accept that the ship is moving and that stopping or turning around is not a real possibility. They are not born of desperation or crisis. They have not lost faith in the ship's technology or in each other's competence. They are simply people who have arrived, with full sincerity and considerable thought, at a conclusion that the mission designers considered unlikely. The conclusion is this: this ship is their home, not a vehicle they are passing through, not a temporary arrangement between a past and a future that belonged to other people. Their parents were born here. Their grandparents were born here. They have no memory of Earth except what is stored in archives, no grief for a world they never knew, no felt debt to a civilization they never lived in. The people who designed this mission had reasons for their choices, real and serious reasons, and those people cannot be blamed for making them. But those people are gone. The present people are here. And they are asking why every aspect of their lives, the allocation of food and water and living space and labour, the priorities of the mission systems, the structure of their education, the organisation of their days, the social contract they were born into, should be organised entirely around the intentions of people who have been dead for 150 years. They are asking a question that sounds simple and is not simple at all. They are asking whether a civilization has an obligation to the choices of its dead. This question does not arise because people are selfish or unreasonable. It arises because it is the rational response of a community that has been fully severed from the original experience that made the mission meaningful. The founding generation launched with Earth still present in their bodies, still felt in their grief and their hope and their determination to find something better on the other side of the darkness. The mission was not an abstraction to them. It was a choice made against a background of everything they were leaving behind. They felt the weight of that background every day. It was the reason the mission mattered. By generation 3 or 4, that background is gone, not faded. Gone, no living person aboard has ever felt it. The founders are history. Earth is a name in a history file. The destination is a name in a different file. What is real is the ship. What is present is this community. Today, in these corridors, breathing this air, tending these systems, and the question of why those systems should be organised around a goal chosen by people who lived more than a century ago for reasons no living person has ever felt, is not a question that the mission document can answer by itself. The patterns here are not imaginary. They are well documented. Historians who study utopian communities, deliberately isolated intentional settlements, colonial expeditions, and closed religious communities find this pattern with striking consistency across cultures and centuries. First-generation members maintain mission loyalty because they chose the mission and remember the alternative. The choice was theirs, the reasons are felt, the sacrifice has personal meaning. Second-generation members inherit the mission as identity, which is different from choice but still carries real commitment, real attachment, real willingness to sacrifice. By the third generation, a measurable fraction begins to experience the founding principles not as living values, but as inherited constraint. The principles are still honoured. They are not felt. By the fourth and fifth generation, that fraction is larger. And in communities that have no access to new members, no external reinforcement, no contact with a larger world that validates the founding purpose, the fraction keeps growing. Most intentional communities in human history that did not receive new members, new resources, or external reinforcement began to fracture within 3 to 5 generations. Not all of them failed entirely. but almost none maintained their original social contract intact across that span. The generation ship, by design, receives none of the external reinforcements that have historically helped isolated communities hold together. No new arrivals carrying fresh energy and fresh conviction. No external authority whose recognition makes the mission feel legitimate. No contact with a larger civilization whose continued existence makes the founding purpose feel like part of something real and ongoing. The people who built the ship built it to carry humanity to another star. They could not build it to carry consent across the generations they would never see. And consent across centuries is what the mission actually requires. The water recycler is in the lower maintenance deck. 3 engineers are working on it. All of them were born on the ship. 2 of them trained specifically for this system and know it well, in the way that people know a system they have worked on for years, with the accumulated feel of it that training alone does not give. The third is filling a vacancy left by an engineer who died unexpectedly before completing the knowledge transfer to her designated replacement. The repair they are attempting is not catastrophic. It is not a crisis. The primary filtration membrane is degrading at a rate slightly faster than the replacement schedule predicted. This has happened before, in this same system, with this same type of membrane. There are notes in the system log from a previous repair made 43 years ago by an engineer whose training records are partially intact in the archive. The problem is that the component they are looking at is not quite the same as the one described in those notes. Somewhere in the decades between that previous repair and this one, the system was modified. The modification was documented at the time, but the documentation was entered into a subsystem archive that was reorganized twice since then, under 2 different information management teams who each had their own organizational logic. The current search interface does not reliably surface records from the previous archive architecture. The documentation exists, it is there, but finding it requires knowing it exists, and knowing where in the old architecture it was stored, and understanding the search terms that the previous team used when they created it. The repair manual they have describes the original design. The system in front of them is the original design plus 40 years of modifications, some fully documented, some partially documented, some perhaps not documented at all, made by engineers who each understood their part of the system fully and may have trusted that the next person would figure out the rest. They will make the repair. They are skilled, careful, and taking nothing for granted. They will work through the manual, trace back through the modification logs they can find, test carefully, and make the repair with as much confidence as the available information allows. But the process will take longer than it should. And when they write up their work, they will add their own notes to a record that is already imperfect, and the next team, years from now, will face a similar situation. This is how technical knowledge erodes in a closed system across time. Not through catastrophic loss, not through negligence or carelessness, not through any single dramatic failure that someone could have prevented. Through the slow, quiet accumulation of small gaps, each one manageable, each one papered over, each one passed forward to the next team, in a record that is slightly less complete than the one before it. Each gap is manageable individually. Each repair is made, each system continues to function, but the complete, coherent understanding that existed in the minds of the original designers is being replaced, generation by generation, with a distributed, partial understanding that works well enough in normal conditions and becomes unreliable precisely when conditions are not normal. The most instructive real-world analogue is Biosphere 2. Built in the Arizona desert and sealed in September of 1991, Biosphere 2 was the most serious attempt in human history to create a self-sustaining closed ecological system. The scientists who built it had spent years designing it. They understood its systems thoroughly. They had access to external expertise at any moment during the experiment. They could end the experiment if necessary. Within months, oxygen levels inside the habitat had dropped to the point where the crew was experiencing cognitive impairment. The cause turned out to be carbon dioxide absorption by the new concrete in the structure, a process the models had not fully accounted for. Several food crops failed to produce adequately. The crew experienced significant caloric deficit throughout the 2 years of the experiment. Ants and cockroaches, which had been inadvertently brought into the biosphere in soil samples, proliferated beyond the capacity of the original ecosystem design to control them. The team experienced serious interpersonal conflicts that fractured into 2 factions that were barely speaking to each other by the end. Biosphere 2 lasted less than 2 years before requiring outside intervention to stabilize oxygen levels. 8 highly educated, highly motivated adults, in a closed system they understood completely, with full access to external support at any time, could not maintain it without outside help for 2 years. A generation ship must sustain a far more complex system across centuries, staffed by people who did not design it, and who inherit it in a state that is always somewhat different from its documented state, with no outside support of any kind available at any point in the crossing. The redundancies built into the ship's design help. Every critical system has backups. Every backup has maintenance procedures. Every procedure is documented. These are not trivial safeguards. They represent serious engineering work, and they provide real protection against the kinds of acute failures, the sudden ruptures, and equipment malfunctions that might otherwise end the mission quickly. What redundancy cannot protect against is the slow degradation of the human knowledge base that keeps the whole system running correctly over centuries. Every repair is also a knowledge transfer. Every knowledge transfer is imperfect. Over 40 generations, the imperfections accumulate in ways that no audit system was designed to catch, because the problem is not in the records. The records may be accurate. The problem is in the gap between what the records say and what a living engineer needs to understand to use them well. The ship at year 800 or year 1000 may be running on systems that have been modified, reinterpreted, and rebuilt by dozens of generations of people who each understood the part they touched. Whether anyone still holds a complete and coherent understanding of the whole is a different question. Not because the people were careless. Because this is what happens to technical knowledge in any closed system across time. It is not a failure of intelligence or commitment. It is the natural consequence of passing human understanding through a long chain of imperfect transmissions without the ability to recharge it from outside. There is a concept in systems theory called tight coupling, and it describes one of the most dangerous properties a complex system can have. A loosely coupled system is one where the components have enough independence that a failure in one place can be isolated, absorbed, and repaired before it spreads to the others. There is slack in the connections. There is time to respond. There are buffers between the failure and its consequences. A tightly coupled system is one where the components are so closely connected that a failure in one place propagates quickly and directly into the others, without enough slack to absorb the stress before it becomes something worse. The failure moves faster than the response can keep up. And in a tightly coupled system under accumulated stress, small failures do not stay small. A generation ship is, by necessity, one of the most tightly coupled complex systems ever imagined. Its social stability depends on its technical systems functioning reliably. Its technical systems depend on the knowledge and active cooperation of its social community. Its genetic health depends on the social structures governing reproduction and family formation across generations. Its psychological well-being depends on the felt meaningfulness of the mission. The felt meaningfulness of the mission depends on the cultural transmission systems. The cultural transmission systems depend on the knowledge preservation infrastructure. The knowledge preservation infrastructure depends on the social institutions. The social institutions depend on the governance structures. The governance structures depend on the shared legitimacy of the mission. Every component is connected to every other component, and the connections run in all directions simultaneously. Year 400. The water recycler is running at 80% of rated capacity. This is not immediately dangerous. The engineering team is working on it. The system has reserves, but at 80%, water allocation has been reduced slightly across the ship. The reduction is small, about 5% per person per day, and most people barely notice it consciously. But it is there, a low-level background pressure, like a headache that never quite develops fully, but never fully goes away. The Genetic Health Committee has not convened in 3 years. The council that oversees it is in the middle of a governance dispute about committee membership and representation that has resisted resolution for 18 months. The committee's records are maintained. The monitoring data is being collected, but the active analysis and the proactive management program have slipped because active management requires the committee to meet, and the committee cannot meet while the dispute continues. The labour assignment system that distributes maintenance responsibilities across the population is running, but a significant faction has been in partial non-compliance for over a year following a dispute about how heavy maintenance rotations are allocated. The engineering teams are covering the critical work. The non-critical maintenance is backing up. The backlog is growing slowly, in ways that will matter in 5 years more than they matter today. No single one of these conditions is catastrophic, but they are not independent of each other. The water reduction increases low-level stress across the population. Stress makes people more reactive to fairness violations. Reactivity to fairness violations makes the governance dispute harder to resolve. The unresolved governance dispute delays the genetic committee. The delayed genetic committee allows a slow drift in the monitoring program. The reduced maintenance staffing means the water recycler repair takes longer. The longer the repair takes, the longer the water reduction persists. The longer the water reduction persists, the higher the background stress. The feedback loop runs in all directions, reinforcing itself as it goes. Systems theorist Charles Perrow developed the concept of normal accidents to describe exactly this kind of failure. Not because the failures are ordinary, but because they are the natural consequence of tight coupling under accumulated stress. Each individual component is operating within its design parameters. The failure emerges not from any single point, but from the interaction of stressed components that were designed to work together and are now failing together. The connection to the generation ship situation is not metaphorical. Biosphere 2 demonstrated this at small scale. When oxygen levels dropped, the crew's cognitive function was impaired. Impaired cognition affected the quality of the decisions being made about the biological systems that produced oxygen. Poorer decisions about oxygen production further reduced oxygen levels. The loop ran in all directions simultaneously, and no single intervention was sufficient to break it cleanly. On a generation ship, the loops are more numerous and more entangled, and the time available to recognize and respond to them is measured in generations rather than weeks. The cascade does not require a dramatic trigger. A meteor strike, a catastrophic system failure, a sudden violent uprising. The cascade requires only accumulated stress, the slow convergence of problems that each seemed manageable in isolation. and the absence of a relief valve capable of releasing pressure before the components begin to fail together. What makes this particularly difficult to manage is that the people living through the early stages of a cascade may not recognize it as such. From the inside, what they see is a water recycler that is being repaired, a governance dispute that is ongoing, a maintenance backlog that is growing. Each of these things has happened before in the ship's history. Each of them has been resolved before. The institutions have weathered individual problems. What the individuals experiencing the current situation may not see clearly is that these are not separate problems happening simultaneously. They are a single pattern, reinforcing itself. In a system that was not designed with enough slack to absorb multiple simultaneous stresses over a sustained period. The people who recognized the cascade pattern would need to act on it before it became visible as a crisis, addressing not the individual problems but the interactions between them, the feedback loops that were turning manageable individual stresses into a connected failure mode. That requires a kind of systems-level understanding that is hard to maintain across generations and hard to act on politically, because the interventions it demands are often not obvious to people who are focused on the individual problems in front of them. The ship may still be moving at year 400. The engine may still be running. The destination may still be getting imperceptibly closer. And inside, a civilization may be approaching the point where its individual systems can no longer compensate for each other's weakness. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but quietly and persistently, the way all the most dangerous failures in complex systems actually occur. The question is not whether such a cascade is inevitable. It is not. Many scenarios exist in which the ship's institutions and people navigate accumulated stress successfully. The question is whether the design, the governance, the cultural transmission, and the sheer resilience of the community are adequate to the specific challenges that accumulate across centuries in a closed system with no outside help. That question cannot be answered from the outside. It can only be answered by the people living it. The problems traced through this conversation are not new discoveries that researchers are only beginning to understand. Generation ship feasibility has been studied seriously for decades, and the community of researchers who work on it is genuinely interdisciplinary. Physicists and engineers sit alongside geneticists and population biologists, who sit alongside psychologists and sociologists, who sit alongside political philosophers and historians. The problems are known. The range of proposed solutions is real, substantive, and in some cases genuinely inventive. On the genetics problem, the most developed solution involves carrying frozen genetic material alongside the living population. Stored gametes, embryos or DNA sequences that can be introduced into the living population across generations through assisted reproductive technology. This approach effectively enlarges the genetic pool of the mission far beyond its physical headcount. A ship carrying 2,000 people and a genetic library representing 20,000 additional individuals has, in a real biological sense, a much larger effective founding population than the number of warm bodies aboard. The limitations are genuine. The storage and reproductive technology must remain functional across centuries through equipment degradations and power fluctuations and the knowledge erosions that affect every system aboard. The social consensus to actually use the technology must be maintained across the same generations. Each generation must be willing to participate in a genetic management program whose rationale was developed by people who died long before they were born. These are not insurmountable obstacles in theory. They are deeply uncertain in practice, because they require exactly the kind of sustained institutional function across generations that the other pressures aboard are simultaneously undermining. On cultural and technical knowledge transmission, the most thoughtful proposals draw on models from human cultures that successfully maintained complex knowledge across many generations without literacy. Pacific Island navigation, Australian Aboriginal land management knowledge, the maintenance of complex ritual and ceremonial practices across millennia in communities without writing. These traditions demonstrate that human beings can transmit extraordinarily detailed and precise knowledge across centuries through deliberate social structures. Through making knowledge transmission a community-wide practice rather than an individual responsibility, through embedding critical information in ritual and performance that is not optional but woven into the basic fabric of social life. The evidence that this can work is real. These traditions did work for long periods under the right conditions. The conditions include shared meaning, lived relevance, and a community that experiences the knowledge as necessary rather than inherited. On a ship where the systems mostly function and the threats the knowledge protects against are not currently visible, maintaining that sense of necessity across generations requires active, constant institutional effort, and that effort competes with all the other pressures on the community's attention and energy. On governance, the most sophisticated proposals involve constitutional frameworks explicitly designed for the long term, with built-in mechanisms for revision that balance the need for stability with the need for adaptation. Rotating authority structures that prevent entrenchment. Explicit provisions for the revision of mission parameters under defined conditions, so that the choice between rigidity and chaos has a legitimate middle path. Some researchers propose what they call mission councils, with rotating membership and term limits structured to maintain institutional memory while preventing any faction from accumulating permanent power. These are serious designs, informed by the full history of constitutional theory and the specific failure modes of isolated governance systems. But every governance scholar who has engaged seriously with the generation ship problem acknowledges the same fundamental constraint. No governance system designed for this duration has ever been tested under these conditions. The longest-running constitutional governments in human history are a few centuries old, and all of them have changed substantially since their founding, in ways their architects did not intend and could not have predicted. On psychology and well-being, the engineering proposals are detailed and evidence-based, full-spectrum lighting with artificial seasons, architectural diversity that prevents the felt sense of perpetual sameness, large interior spaces and natural materials, rich cultural programming, art, music, performance, ritual, meaningful work structured so that people feel they are contributing to something real rather than simply performing maintenance. These measures reduce the psychological costs of long-duration confinement. Research consistently supports them. They genuinely help. What the same research consistently finds is that they reduce those costs, but they do not eliminate them. They make the ship more livable. They do not make confinement into freedom. And what they cannot provide across generations is the one thing that the research on isolated environment well-being most consistently identifies as the foundation of psychological health: felt connection to a meaningful shared purpose that is experienced as chosen, not inherited. All of these solutions share an honest limitation that their proponents acknowledge. They require the people of Generation 20 or Generation 30 to continue maintaining systems, practices, and institutions that were designed by people who lived a century before them, for reasons that no longer feel urgent, toward a destination that still lies many generations away. Whether they will is not a question that laboratory testing or computer modelling can fully answer. It is a question about what human beings actually do when the original reasons for a commitment are no longer immediate, and the people who made the commitment are long dead. History has relevant things to say about that, But the answer is not simple, and it is not uniformly reassuring. What history does suggest is that the most durable human institutions are not the ones with the most detailed rules or the most sophisticated enforcement mechanisms. They are the ones whose purpose is felt rather than merely inherited. The ones where each generation can find, in the practice of the institution, something that speaks to their own experience and their own needs, rather than something that merely belongs to their ancestors. The generation ship's designers can build structures, they can write documents, they can design systems. What they cannot design is the lived experience of the people who will inhabit those structures centuries after launch. The most they can do is create conditions that make it possible for each generation to find the mission meaningful on its own terms. Whether that is possible across 40 generations, whether human beings can sustain that kind of institutional renewal in a closed system without the friction of an outside world to sharpen it against, is the question that the generation ship ultimately poses to human civilization. It is not a question we know the answer to. It is a question we have never had to answer before. The ship is the first attempt. Everything we know points to the difficulty. Nothing we know makes it impossible. And that, in the end, is the honest position the evidence supports. There are no generation ships in human history. The situation is genuinely new. A civilization sealed in a container, moving through interstellar space with no contact with the outside world across centuries, is something humanity has never attempted and has no direct record of. But there are human communities that have faced conditions that partially resemble what a generation ship would produce. And the patterns those communities show across cultures and centuries are consistent enough to tell us something useful about what the theoretical models might miss. In 1790, 9 mutineers from the British naval vessel Bounty settled on Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific, along with 6 Tahitian men and 13 Tahitian women. The island was so remote that it had been incorrectly charted. European powers did not know it was inhabited for nearly 2 decades. A founding community of 28 people on a small island in the middle of the largest ocean on Earth, with no resupply, no contact with the outside world, no possibility of leaving. Within a decade, most of the founding generation was dead, killed in a series of violent conflicts driven by competition over resources and the severe imbalance in how the island's social arrangements had been structured. The men who had led the mutiny had created a hierarchy that concentrated land and status in ways the Tahitian men on the island were unwilling to accept indefinitely. The community nearly collapsed entirely. What survived was the children. The second generation, born on the island, not carrying the specific tensions and grievances that had driven the adults to kill each other, rebuilt the community from scratch around arrangements that bore little resemblance to what the founders had established. They developed their own dialect, their own social customs, their own practical knowledge of the island's resources. By the time the outside world rediscovered Pitcairn in 1808, they found a community that was functioning, coherent, and in some ways thriving, but that would have been nearly unrecognizable to the people who founded it. Pitcairn survived, but what survived was not a continuation of the founding community. It was something new, built on the ruins of the founding community by people who had been born into it. The lesson for the generation ship is not simply that founding communities fail. They do not always. The lesson is that what survives long isolation is rarely what launched. The communities that persisted were the ones that allowed the second and third generation to remake the social contract in ways the founders had not anticipated and might not have approved. Antarctic overwintering stations provide a different kind of analogue, smaller scale and shorter duration, but far more carefully studied. Modern research on these stations, where groups of scientists spend the Antarctic winter in near-total isolation, has produced a consistent and replicable picture of small group dynamics under long-duration confinement. Authority disputes and perceived unfairness arise almost universally. The communities that navigate them best share specific characteristics: explicit conflict resolution procedures that were agreed before the isolation began, rotating responsibilities that prevent resentment from attaching to permanent roles, and shared tasks with visible, measurable outcomes that give the group a felt reason to cooperate beyond mere coexistence. The communities that struggle most are those with unclear authority structures, those where some members feel their contribution is not recognized, and those where interpersonal conflicts from the early phase are allowed to persist without resolution into the late phase. In a 6-month winter, unresolved conflict is uncomfortable. Across a century it becomes structural. The Marshall Islands communities forcibly relocated to remote atolls in the 1940s to clear nuclear testing sites and provided with external support and meaning by the United States government, showed that communities can maintain reasonable cohesion when external support and external meaning continue. When the support was reduced and the meaning became more ambiguous, the communities fragmented in predictable ways. The founding purpose, imposed from outside and never genuinely chosen by the people living it, could not sustain community cohesion once the external authority stopped actively reinforcing it. The lesson that appears across all of these analogues is this: the communities that survived long isolation were almost never the ones that maintained their founding structure intact. They were the ones that adapted. They revised their social contracts. They built new arrangements when the old ones failed. They changed in response to conditions their founders could not have anticipated. Adaptation is the mechanism of survival in isolated communities. The historical record on this point is clear. For the generation ship, this creates a tension that no design can fully resolve. An adaptable community is a resilient community. A community capable of revising its practices in response to conditions its founders did not anticipate is one that can potentially survive the unexpected, and the unexpected across a multi-century voyage is certain to occur. But a community that has adapted sufficiently may no longer be the community that launched. The mission it is carrying out may have been revised in ways the founders would not recognize. The social contract may have been rebuilt from different foundations. The people aboard may carry the genes of the founders, but almost nothing else of what the founders intended. The communities that survived were the ones that changed. The question for a generation ship is whether a civilization can change enough to survive without losing the thread that connects it to what it launched to do. The ship arrives. Year 1000, or year 800, or year 1200, depending on the trajectory, the speed, the specific decisions made across the centuries of the crossing, and the adaptations the community underwent to survive them. The people aboard stand at the observation ports and look at something no human being has ever seen from this distance and at this scale: a planet that is not Earth, orbiting a star that is not the Sun, hanging in a darkness that the ship has been crossing for longer than any nation in human history has existed. They have arrived. Whatever happened during the centuries between launch and this moment, however much the community changed, however many crises were survived or partially survived, however far the current inhabitants are from the people who sealed the doors at the beginning, they are here. Now the question of what they can actually do. The colonization plan is in the archive. It was written by Earth engineers working with the best available science of their time, designed to walk an arriving crew through the specific steps required to establish a presence on an alien world. atmospheric analysis protocols, surface landing procedures, habitat construction under conditions that may differ from Earth in ways that affect everything from material behavior to biological response, agricultural adaptation methods for soil chemistry and light spectrum that may not match what the ship's crops were designed for, medical preparation for an environment that may contain biological or chemical elements that human immune systems have never encountered. The plan is thorough. It was designed by people who were very good at what they did. That time was 1,000 years ago. The technology described in the plan has been maintained, modified, and in some cases rebuilt from scratch across 40 generations of engineers who each understood their part of what they inherited. Some of it is probably more capable than what the founders designed, refined by generations of practical maintenance into something better than the original. Some of it may be less capable in ways that are not obvious until it is actually used, degraded by the same knowledge erosions that affected every other technical system aboard. Some critical understanding about why specific procedures were designed the way they were, the reasoning beneath the steps, may have eroded along the way. The arriving community is not helpless. They are capable people who have spent their lives maintaining extraordinarily complex systems under difficult conditions. They are, in many respects, among the most technically competent people their civilization has ever produced, because incompetence in their environment is not tolerated by the physics of survival. The people who could not learn and adapt and cooperate did not survive long enough to pass their patterns on. The people who could, did, but they have never been outside. Not one person currently alive on the ship has ever stood on an uncontrolled planetary surface. None of them has experienced weather they did not create. None of them has felt unfiltered sunlight, or rain, or the specific quality of wind that comes off open water. None of them has farmed in an environment where the soil chemistry, the light spectrum, the temperature variation, and the biological inhabitants were not manufactured and controlled. None of them has dealt with the 1,000 small surprises that a real planetary environment produces for people encountering it for the first time. The colonization plan was written for people who had spent their lives on Earth. The people arriving have spent their lives on the ship. There is an additional complication that the planners knew about but could not fully solve. The planet at the destination may not be exactly what the original survey data suggested. At interstellar distances, pre-arrival surveys can determine broad characteristics, whether an atmosphere exists, whether liquid water is present, whether the temperature range is compatible with life. What they cannot determine with certainty are the fine-grained details that determine whether a colonization attempt succeeds or fails. The exact composition of the soil, the specific spectrum of pathogens or biochemicals present in the environment, the precise behavior of the local weather systems, whether any of the planet's biology, if it exists, will interact with human biology in ways that the medical preparation aboard anticipated. The colonization plan was written with careful assumptions about what the planet would be like, if those assumptions were correct. The plan is a reasonable starting point. If they were wrong in specific ways, the arriving community will need to adapt in real time, with whatever knowledge and flexibility they have managed to preserve across the centuries of the crossing. Historical analogues here are instructive even if imperfect. The Jamestown colony of 1607, often cited as one of the foundational examples of long-distance colonial settlement, had resupply ships making regular crossings from England. It had the financial backing of a major commercial venture with substantial resources. It had immediate access to indigenous Powhatan communities who held centuries of practical knowledge about the local environment. It had contact with the full weight of European civilization behind it. Jamestown lost the majority of its population in its first years. The winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, reduced a settlement of several hundred people to 60 survivors. The arriving generation of the ship has none of what Jamestown had. No resupply ships. No backing organisation. No indigenous knowledge holders. No connection to any external civilization, just the colonisation plan, the equipment aboard, the skills of the people who survived the crossing, and whatever the planet actually is, which may differ from what the original surveys suggested in ways that the plan did not prepare for. They will try. They will apply everything they have. The models that take seriously both the challenges of the crossing and the capabilities of a well-prepared arriving community suggest that success is possible. The people who arrive will not be passive. They will be determined, resourceful, and deeply accustomed to solving problems with the resources available to them. But arrival does not end the challenge. In some important ways, it begins the hardest one. Because now, for the first time, the world outside the hull is real. It is not a photograph. It is not a founding myth. It is there, visible through the observation ports, with its own weather and its own chemistry and its own indifference to whether the mission succeeds. The ship was the test the mission designers could plan for. The planet is the test they could not. The ship is still moving. It has been moving for the entire length of this conversation. While everything described here was unfolding, while the communities formed and fractured and adapted and reformed, while the knowledge eroded and was partially recovered, while the governance held and bent and was revised, while the genetics drifted and was managed with varying success, the ship itself continued on its path. Straight, silent, indifferent to the human story inside it. From the outside, if there were anything outside to observe it, the ship looks like certainty. A machine in motion. Physics made visible. A trajectory that does not bend. From the inside, it is something else entirely. It is a civilization asking itself in each generation whether it still believes in what it is doing. This is the question that no engineering specification can answer. Whether the genetic population is large enough, whether the governance structure holds for 3 centuries or 5, whether the cultural transmission systems keep the critical knowledge readable across 40 generations. All of these questions have answers that depend on a prior question. Do the people inside still want to be there? Not in the sense of having chosen it. Most of them did not. But in the sense of choosing in each ordinary day inside the ship to maintain the systems, to honour the structures, to teach the children what needs to be known, to tend the machinery, to keep the thread alive. That choosing happens in small, unwitnessed moments. An engineer who stays an extra hour to write up the repair clearly for whoever comes next. A teacher who finds a new way to make the water chemistry feel urgent rather than routine. A council member who does the harder work of the compromise rather than the easier work of the grievance. These are not dramatic acts. They do not appear in mission histories, but they are the substance of what keeps a civilization together across centuries. A generation ship is not, in the deepest sense, a test of engineering. It is a test of meaning. Can a civilization carry its reasons forward across centuries? In the absence of the original experience that generated those reasons? Can the descendants of people who made a choice continue to live as though the choice matters, even when the original choice is not felt but only inherited? This is not a new question that only the generation ship poses. Every civilization in history has faced some version of it. Every generation inherits a world it did not build, structured around choices it did not make, organized by values it did not originate. Every generation must decide, consciously or not, how much of what it inherited to maintain, how much to revise, and where the boundary between revision and abandonment actually lies. The difference is that most civilizations have had the luxury of doing this gradually, in contact with other civilizations, in an environment that continually offers new challenges and new resources and new experiences that refresh the original reasons in forms appropriate to the present. The generation ship does not have that luxury. It has the mission, the archive, the engine, the people. And the question that moves through every corridor, felt by no one in particular and by everyone at once, is whether that is enough to carry a civilization from one star to another across the centuries it takes to make the crossing. What history offers, honestly examined, is not a confident answer either way. It offers evidence that small communities can endure extraordinary conditions for long periods when the right structural elements are in place. It offers evidence that those same communities can fragment when those elements erode. It offers case after case of civilizations that survived by changing, and in changing, became something their founders would not have recognized. The generation ship may arrive with a civilization aboard. It will almost certainly not arrive with the same civilization that launched. Whether the civilization that does arrive is capable of doing what it was sent to do, whether it still carries enough of the original knowledge and purpose and technical competence to actually plant humanity in another star system, is the question that all the engineering and all the social design and all the careful genetics is ultimately in service of answering. No one knows the answer yet. The ship has not been built. The voyage has not been taken. The people who will actually live and die inside it have not yet been born. What we do know is the shape of the challenge. The shape of the challenge tells us that it is not primarily a challenge of machinery. It is a challenge of what human beings carry with them when everything else is taken away. It is a challenge of whether the things that make a civilization worth preserving, curiosity, cooperation, the willingness to tend what is in front of you for reasons larger than yourself, can be transmitted across centuries in the dark without the world to sharpen them against. That is the question. The answer will be given by people who have not yet been born, in a place none of us will ever see. Tonight, we came to explore what it would take to send a civilization into deep space and keep it alive long enough to reach another star. We explored it. And the answer, arrived at honestly, is not a number of years. It is not a hull specification or a population figure or a governance framework, though all of these matter and all of them have real answers that researchers are working on. The answer is not a single thing that can be solved and then considered solved. The answer is this: a generation ship could last as long as the people inside it choose to maintain it. Not the founding generation. Not the arriving generation. Every generation in between. In the long, unmarked, ordinary middle of the crossing, where there is no excitement of departure and no hope of arrival, just the daily work of keeping a civilization alive in the dark. The ship lasts as long as the people tend it. That is harder than it sounds. History does not offer reassuring examples of civilizations that held their coherence and purpose intact across many centuries in closed environments without external reinforcement. It offers examples of communities that tried and eventually changed beyond recognition, sometimes into something worse than what they started as, sometimes into something better, sometimes into something so different that the question of whether it is the same community at all becomes genuinely unanswerable. What history does suggest is that the communities capable of surviving long isolation are not the ones with the most rigid structures or the most perfectly designed systems. They are the ones with enough shared meaning to hold together through change, enough flexibility to adapt without losing the thread, and enough people in each generation willing to do the quiet, unwitnessed work of maintaining what matters. The girl who was born on the ship, the one who has never seen a horizon, who knows the smell of the recycled air and the sound of the water filtration unit and every face in her section, she is not thinking about any of this right now. She is tending the recycler. She is teaching the younger children the names of the components and the sequence of the procedures, and as much of the reasoning behind the procedures as she herself understands. She is living her life in the only world she has ever known, doing the work that keeps that world alive because it is her world and because the work needs doing. She does not know if the mission will succeed. She cannot know if the civilization she is part of will still recognize itself when it arrives. She does not know, and could not know, whether the 1,000 small decisions and the long, slow erosions and the adaptations and the crises and the recoveries happening across the ship will converge into something that completes what the founders began. She does not need to know. What she knows is the recycler. What she knows is the names of the children in her class and the sound the filtration unit makes when it shifts phase, and the particular smell of the air in the lower maintenance corridors after a repair. What she knows is the specific quality of the silence in the observation bay at the end of the day cycle, when the stars outside the ports are cold and very far away and absolutely still, not moving, never seeming to move. The destination somewhere ahead in the dark, unreachable and real. She tends what is in front of her. She passes along what she knows. She shows the younger children how to tell when the membrane is degrading by the sound rather than the readout, because the sound comes first and the readout follows, and the difference matters. She explains the reasoning, not just the steps, because she was taught that way, and she understands, without being able to fully articulate it, that the reasoning is what survives when conditions change. In this way, in small rooms and maintenance bays and classrooms in the middle of the dark, a civilization continues, and tonight, in the silence between stars, that is the thing the ship most needs. Not a perfect governance system, not a fully preserved genetic library, not a complete and coherent technical archive. All of those things matter. But what the ship needs first and most and always is people who tend what is in front of them. The ship is still moving. Good night.